Mom said. "You're not even part of this family anymore." When I refused to give her money, I just blocked her number. Yesterday, she showed up crying at my office. I knew something was wrong the second my assistant knocked. Twice. She never did that unless it was urgent. "There's a woman out here," she whispered like someone announcing a ghost sighting. "Says she's your mother?" My stomach didn't drop. It didn't lurch. It just stilled. Like everything inside me had gone quiet at once. It wasn't fear. It wasn't dread. It was the kind of calm you feel when a storm's been raging for years and suddenly, finally, it stops. I stood slowly, straightened my shirt, and walked to the glass door of my office. And there she was. Barbara Lane. My mother. Standing in reception like a shattered version of the woman who used to bark orders at me with a cigarette dangling from her fingers and a guilt trip locked and loaded behind her tongue. Her makeup was smeared. Her coat was hanging off one shoulder. And her eyes, swollen and frantic, darted toward mine the second she saw me. "David," she breathed, stepping forward. "Please." My assistant looked between us like she'd wandered into the climax of a movie she hadn't seen the first 2 hours of. I turned to her and said calmly, "Give us a few minutes." She nodded, hesitated, then walked away. I held the door open for my mother. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The look on my face must have told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't going to go the way she thought. She walked in, clutching her purse like it might hold a parachute. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat. I didn't know who else to call. She started. Her voice cracked on the last word. I let the silence sit there. Let her feel it. Let her realize how unfamiliar that silence was between us, for her. She looked up at me, confused, like maybe I'd been swapped out for someone else. And in a way, I had. Because the man standing in front of her now wasn't the boy who emptied his college fund to cover her credit card debt. He wasn't the teenager who lied to his friends about why he couldn't afford gas. He wasn't the 30-year-old who took out a second job when she, accidentally, spent her rent money on a pyramid scheme. I wasn't her emotional hostage anymore. And for the first time in our long, messy story, I was ready to talk like it. The thing about my mother was that she always cried when the script started slipping. I used to fall for it. Every time. The watery eyes, the shaking hands, the whispered, "I never meant to hurt you." She wore guilt like perfume, something sprayed on before entering a room, strong enough to choke you before you even realized what was happening. But not this time. "You look good," she said, trying to smile. "Healthier than before. You must be eating better." I didn't respond. I just watched her twist her wedding ring, the same one she'd pawned and repurchased 3 different times like it was a rental. She waited for me to say something. Anything. So I did. "You told me I wasn't part of the family anymore." Her smile faltered. "David, I was upset." "You were?" "No," I said. Calm. Steady. "You were angry because I wouldn't give you money." Again. Her mouth opened, then closed. Like she was picking which version of the truth to tell. I watched her sift through the Rolodex of excuses she'd perfected over the years. But she must have known, nothing she pulled out would work now. "I needed help," she finally said. "Your brother, he's in trouble. And I didn't know what else to do." There it was. The first clue. It was never about her. It was about Danny. The golden child. The addict-turned-alleged entrepreneur who somehow always found himself drowning in problems someone else had to solve. "Let me guess," I said. "He made a mistake. And you just need something to get back on your feet." "Right." She looked down. That was when the memory hit me. I was 12, sitting on the front porch with a bag of ice on my eye because Danny had shoved me into the TV stand. Mom didn't yell at him. She handed me a 20 and told me to go buy ice cream. Like sugar could soak up bruises. "You've always helped," she said softly. "Even when you were a kid. You've always been dependable. I let out a short laugh. Not bitter. Not loud. Just hollow. Yeah, I said. Because I was raised to believe love had to be earned. Bought, actually. Through silence, sacrifice, and bank transfers. She flinched. Do you know what it feels like to grow up believing that if you didn't bail your mother out, she'd stop loving you? Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. I stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and leaned my hands on the edge of the desk. You don't get to rewrite history just because you're crying in my office now. You made it clear who I was to you, a wallet with a heartbeat. She started to sob. Really sob. But I didn't move. I wasn't here to save her anymore. Her crying used to shake me. As a kid, it was the sound that turned my spine to jelly, that made me dig through drawers for coins, that got me to lie to teachers about why I hadn't eaten lunch. The first time I saw her cry, I thought it was my fault. I think that's what she counted on. But now, watching her cry in my office, designer coat slipping off her shoulder, mascara trailing like wet ink, I felt nothing. No pity. No anger. Just stillness. You don't understand. She choked out between sobs. You've never had to choose between keeping the lights on and feeding your kids. You've never had to feel so helpless you want to disappear. I tilted my head. Funny. I remember those exact feelings when I was 24, working 3 jobs to pay off the debts you left in my name. Her crying stalled for a breath. Like her body had frozen under the weight of what I just said. I worked nights, I continued. Slept in my car some weeks, skipped meals, and you know what I kept telling myself? That it was temporary. That once I pulled you out of whatever mess you'd gotten into, you'd get better. But you didn't. You just got more creative with your emergencies. David, I am better, she whispered. I've been trying. You've been surviving, Mom. At the expense of anyone who loved you. There was a long pause. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Slid it across the desk toward me like a poker player making a final gamble. I didn't touch it. What is that? I asked. A payment plan, she said. For the money. I talked to someone. A counselor. I'm trying to fix this. To fix us. I didn't say anything. Because this was a move I'd seen before. The illusion of accountability. The performance of change. A hollow gesture meant to soften the blow before asking for something bigger. This isn't about the money, I said. It never was. She looked confused. And then, defensive. I came here because I have no one left. She snapped, voice trembling. You're my son. I nodded slowly. No. I was your son. Until you decided that title only applied when I was useful. She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. I'm not a lifeline anymore. I'm not a fallback. And I'm definitely not the scared little boy who would do anything to earn your love. I walked around to the other side of the desk. Stood tall. And if that's the only kind of love you know how to give, you can keep it. I reached behind her, opened the office door. She turned, blinking at the hallway like it was another country. Please, David, she whispered. Don't do this. But I already had. I held the door open and waited. Not a word. Not a flinch. Just a quiet, steady presence. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like years. Maybe ever. Like she was searching for some trace of the boy she used to control. The one who'd show up at 2 a.m. when her heat got shut off. The one who maxed out his credit cards to pay for her root canal while she told her friends I owed her everything. But that boy wasn't there anymore. What stood in front of her now was a man who had built a life in spite of her, not because of her. And I think that realization hit her harder than anything I'd said. You're really going to throw me out? She said quietly, like it was some final test I was supposed to fail. No, I replied. You did that when you said I wasn't part of the family anymore. Her lip quivered. And I knew she was about to pull the oldest trick in the book. That tone, the wounded matriarch, the how dare you victimhood she wore so effortlessly. "You think this is easy for me?" she said, voice cracking. "You think I wanted it to be like this?" I didn't answer. Because it wasn't a question. It was bait. She stood, still clutching her purse like it might shield her from reality. I made mistakes. I'm your mother, David." I nodded slowly. "You're right. You are. And you made your choice. The moment you told me I wasn't family, you freed me." That silenced her. I stepped aside so she could pass. She hesitated, one last chance, one final glance to see if I'd break, if I'd cave. I didn't. She walked out. Her heels clicked down the hallway like the ticking of a clock running out. My assistant looked up, startled, but I shook my head. No need for questions. No need for sympathy. I stepped back into my office, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment. And then I exhaled. For the first time in my life, I felt weightless. Not numb. Not cold. Free. The quiet after she left felt sacred. I stood in my office, staring at the space she had occupied just moments before. There was an indentation in the seat where she'd sat, a shallow dent, already fading, like a footprint in wet sand. That was her legacy in my life now. Something temporary. Something soft, easily erased. I walked back to my desk and sat down. Not because I had work to do. I couldn't have focused if I tried. But because I needed to feel grounded. The air still carried a faint trace of her perfume. Not the expensive kind. The kind she bought in bulk from the clearance bin and sprayed on too heavy, like armor. I remembered being 5, maybe 6, watching her get ready for a date. She never looked at me directly in the mirror, just made sure I wasn't blocking her light. She told me not to wait up. I always did. It's funny what sticks with you. Not birthdays. Not hugs. Not warmth. But moments like that. And I realized, sitting there in that silence, that I had spent my entire life writing her story for her. Making excuses. Filling in the blanks. Telling myself, she's trying. She's just scared. She loves me in her own way. But the truth is simpler. Harder. She loved what I gave her. Not who I was. And now, for the first time, I wasn't giving her anything. Not time. Not money. Not guilt. Just a closed door. I pulled open my desk drawer and saw the old manila folder I kept hidden at the back. It was filled with notes. Dates of payments I'd made for her, rent I'd covered, loans I'd taken out in my name to save her from drowning. I used to keep it so I wouldn't lose track. But now, I looked at it with a kind of detached amusement. I didn't need proof anymore. I didn't need validation. I had the truth. And the truth had set me free. The next morning, I half expected to find her waiting in the lobby. She'd done that before, years ago, when she wanted me to co-sign for a loan she swore she'd pay back. She had camped out for 2 hours with coffee and bagels, pretending like it was a sweet surprise. That morning, she'd left with my signature. But today? Nothing. No calls. No texts. No guilt-laced voicemails. I guess she finally believed me. I poured my coffee a little slower than usual, savoring the moment. It wasn't just caffeine, it was confirmation. The silence that used to mean abandonment now felt like peace. When I stepped into my office, my assistant gave me a look. A careful, curious look. "She okay?" she asked, not pressing too hard. I considered lying. Saying she was just upset. That it was family stuff, nothing big. But then I realized, why protect her story anymore? She used me, I said simply. For years. My assistant blinked. Oh. I nodded. She came here to do it again. I told her no. There was a beat of silence. Then she smiled, not the sympathetic kind, but the quiet, Respect you more now, kind. Good, she said. That's good. And it was. Throughout the day, I kept waiting for the emotional fallout. The grief. The guilt. That hollow ache that used to settle in my chest every time I disappointed her. But it never came. Instead, I worked. I took meetings. I laughed with a client. I ordered lunch just because I felt like it. It wasn't a remarkable day, not by any stretch. But it was mine. Entirely, completely mine. No invisible strings tugging at my wallet. No voice in the back of my head asking what if she needs you. No fear of who she'd turn against me next. Just life. Unburdened. It came at 10:47 p.m. One last attempt, I guess. One final card from the bottom of the deck. I was lying on the couch, half watching a movie I'd seen a dozen times, when my phone buzzed. It was a text. Her name lit up the screen like a ghost that didn't know it was dead. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. I didn't mean what I said. You'll always be my son. I didn't know what to do. I'm scared. Please don't shut me out. I need you. There it was. The pivot. From rage to regret. From disowning me to trying to reel me back in. Classic Barbara Lane. Once upon a time, that message would have broken me. Would have made me drive across town in the middle of the night just to hug her, apologize, fix whatever was wrong, even if I didn't break it. But now it just made me tired. Because the truth was, she had meant what she said. In that moment, when I stopped being useful, she stripped the word, son, from me like it was a coat she never liked in the first place. And now she wanted me to wear it again. I didn't reply. I didn't even type something and delete it. I just sat there in the stillness of my apartment, in the home I paid for, built with hours she never asked about, sacrifices she never saw. And I thought, this is what freedom feels like. I watched the message sit there on my screen, glowing like a dying ember. Then I pressed and held her name. And blocked it. Again. Only this time, I didn't feel a trace of guilt. 2 days passed. No new numbers. No surprise voicemails from relatives. No sudden knock on my door in the middle of the night. I think she got the message. That quiet should have felt lonely. And maybe a tiny part of me was bracing for it to sneak in late at night, curl around my chest like an old ache. But it never did. What settled instead was something I'd never truly experienced before in relation to her. Closure. I spent the weekend cleaning the apartment, not because it was messy, but because something inside me needed to mark the transition. A ritual. A fresh start. Every drawer I wiped out, every shelf I dusted, I felt like I was shaking off years of emotional mildew. I came across a box of old photos at the back of my closet. A shoebox I hadn't opened in years. And out of some strange compulsion, I sat cross-legged on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside were snapshots of birthdays where I had paid for the cake. Christmas mornings where I wore the same shirt because buying gifts took priority over new clothes. A picture of me at 17, holding up my acceptance letter to a college I never got to attend because she needed help with. Just one more thing. And yet, I didn't burn the box. I didn't cry over it either. I just looked at it like you look at an old scar. You remember how much it hurt. But it doesn't bleed anymore. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, stood on the balcony, and looked out over the city. The sky was a kind of navy that only shows up in winter, quiet, vast, unbothered. I thought about what I'd say to her if I ever did see her again. Maybe something like, "You spent your whole life teaching me that love had conditions. That I had to earn a seat at the table. That if I didn't bend, I'd break. And when I finally stood up straight, you called it betrayal." Or maybe, I wouldn't say anything at all. Because maybe the best way to show someone they no longer have control over you is to live well without needing them to know it. I leaned against the railing and took a sip. That text was the last thing she'll ever say to me. And silence? Silence will be my reply forever. Monday morning came, and with it, the usual flow of email pings and back-to-back meetings. I slipped into work like a man stepping onto a moving train, effortlessly. No hesitation, no dragging emotional baggage behind me like a carry-on I couldn't afford to check. My coworkers didn't notice a difference. Why would they? I'd always been the dependable one. The early riser. The fixer. The calm in chaos. But what they didn't know was that for the first time in my life, I was only carrying my weight. Not hers. Not my brother's. Not the debts, the lies, or the desperate rescues dressed up as helping family. Just me. And it felt like breathing with new lungs. That afternoon, I had lunch with Eric, a friend I'd made after finally cutting off my family a year ago, during one of their quieter implosions. We sat at our usual spot on the patio behind a cafe near the office. Winter sun filtering through bare tree branches, city noise softened by distance. He was the first person I'd ever told the full story to. When I finished explaining what had happened, her showing up, the crying, the begging, the door, I expected some kind of grand reaction. Instead, he just nodded. "You did it," he said. "You finally closed the chapter." "I think it was more than a chapter," I said. "She was the whole book. I just didn't realize I'd outgrown the story." He smiled. "So write a better one." It hit me then, how much of my life had been written by her. Not directly, no. But always in the margins. Her needs dictating my path. Her emergencies rerouting my goals. Her approval, or the absence of it, framing how I saw myself. I had spent 3 decades being her insurance policy, her plan B, her emotional ATM. And I was done. Later that evening, I stopped by the bookstore near my apartment. I hadn't been there in months. I walked the aisles without a plan, just following instinct. A book on solo travel caught my eye, half photography, half memoir. I flipped it open and read a random line. "There are places inside you that don't unlock until you're far enough away from who you used to be." I bought it. I went home and placed it on the coffee table, right next to the stack of unopened mail that didn't include any handwritten letters begging me to reconsider, or cards with checkboxes of guilt masquerading as apologies. Just utility bills. Bank statements. Life things. Clean things. I cooked dinner that night. Real dinner. Not the microwave meals I used to eat between paying her overdue utilities. Steak. Roasted potatoes. Something that filled the room with warmth. I ate slowly. At my own pace. With my own thoughts. And for once, they weren't about her. They were about spring. About possibly taking a trip somewhere. Maybe Lisbon. Maybe Kyoto. I didn't have to ask anyone. I didn't need to make sure she was okay first. I didn't need to worry about leaving someone behind who might set the house on fire just to feel my absence. She wouldn't know where I was. And the truth is, she wouldn't need to. Because Barbara Lane no longer had a window into my life. The curtain was drawn. The show was over. And the man she used to own? He wasn't on stage anymore. The next day, I passed the glass door to my office, the same one she had stepped through just a week ago, and paused. It looked different now. Not because anything had changed. Same silver handle, same soft reflection. But it was what I felt when I looked at it. Power. Choice. I reached for it, turned the handle, and stepped inside, not as her son, not as her savior, but as me. A man who finally understood that peace wasn't something you begged for. It was something you claimed. And as I sat at my desk, I thought about her face when I said it. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. She thought she'd broken me. She didn't realize I was building a life without her. And when I closed that door behind me, I left her on the other side. For good.